I kept this to myself for 50 years. With those words, Charles Duke, Apollo 16's lunar module pilot and one of the youngest men ever to walk on the moon, shook the foundations of what people thought they knew about America's most daring space missions. Since 1972, he had kept a personal secret, a memory that would not go away, despite the repeated reassurances to himself that it was exhaustion, glare on his visor, or imagination. He reports seeing something on the moon's surface that was outside the mission plan, the geology charts, or the handbook of human spaceflight. What did he see? Why did he keep it silent for 5 decades? And is there video to support his claims? To anyone who has ever wondered if the moon still harbors secrets, Duke's testimony is the admission you've been waiting for. If this kind of story touches your heart, if you're someone who cares about truth, responsibility, and speaking up for the voiceless, please like this video, subscribe to our channel Spark Science, and share it with someone who should hear it. Let's get started. By the time Apollo 16 was planned, NASA had already accomplished the missions that once were thought to be impossible. Americans had walked on the moon, planted flags, collected samples, and established that human beings could go to another world and come back alive. But this mission had an even bigger responsibility. Apollo 16 was intended to delve deeper, to go beyond proof of concept and into the beginnings of the moon itself. If they could collect samples of the ancient highlands landscape, scientists believed they might solve the mystery of how the moon itself had come into being. Previous missions had landed in the Maria, those darker, smoother plains that can be seen from our planet. They were easier to travel to and safer to land on, but geologists realized the Maria were quite young. The actual history of the moon was in its shattered highlands, areas so old that they could hold the very bones of the lunar crust. The Descartes Highlands were the target, but scientists couldn't make up their minds what lay in wait. Some believed the area was volcanic. Others said it was the remains of fiery impacts billions of years ago. Apollo 16 was sent to settle the issue once and for all. It was a risk. The ground was uneven, slippery, and unstable. A soft landing was far from assured. Engineers feared the lunar module could sink into deep dust or tilt on concealed slopes. Landing fuel reserves were extremely thin. Each correction, each pause, took away at their safety margin. No simulation could adequately prepare them for what was under Orion's thrusters. And yet NASA staked everything on this mission, aware the Apollo program had just one more to run. They had only one opportunity to show that the risk of the highlands was worthwhile. Apollo 16 was also a story of the men who bore the weight of the mission, John Young, Charles Duke, and Ken Mattingly. Between them, they created a precarious balance of ability, toughness, and redemption. John Young was already a legend, a guy who had piloted Gemini 3, orbited the moon on Apollo 10, and snuck a corned beef sandwich on board as a joke. Cool, deliberate, and unflappably calm, Young was the reassuring hand NASA relied on for impossible descents. Charles Duke, aged 36, was the youngest astronaut to walk on the moon. His journey had not been easy. Duke was assigned to the backup crew of Apollo 13 and had inadvertently exposed Ken Mattingly to rubella, who was replaced at the last moment by NASA. The world recalls Swigert, Lovell, and Hayes for getting out of the explosion in Apollo 13 alive. Duke recalls the feelings of guilt of being the cause for Mattingly never flying that mission. Apollo 16 was his redemption, an opportunity to redeem himself under the most suffocating expectations. And then Ken Mattingly, the man whose bad fortune once deprived him of a place in history. Apollo 16 offered him a second opportunity, although it was an isolating role. He would orbit in solitude in the command module, Casper, maintaining the lifeline open for Young and Duke on the surface. What held the three men together was not excellence but grit. All of them had encountered setbacks that might have destroyed their careers. They came back sharper, stronger, more focused. Their training was brutal, their characters unique, but their cohesion unbeatable. They were, a flight director said, a tightrope crew balancing over the abyss. Apollo training was repetition ad infinitum, honest-to-goodness geology excursions, simulator hours, survival training in deserts and jungles, and continuous drills for malfunction. They simulated pulling around an unconscious crew member in a cumbersome suit, drilled on what to do if the rover malfunctioned miles from the lander, and learned to identify prominent rocks with seconds to describe them on the radio. The Moon rover provided them with unprecedented mobility but also fresh danger. If the rover broke down far from Orion, they might perish before making it back on foot. The suits themselves were works of art but cumbersome and rigid, making every activity a fight against exhaustion. Training pounded effectiveness into their muscles, ingrained crisis reactions into reflex. But there was one thing that no drill had prepared them for, the chance to find the unexplainable. They practiced for rocks, for dust, for mechanical failure, not for shadows where none should be. On April 20, 1972, Orion broke off from Casper and descended into the Descartes Highlands. Young flew the controls with his hands, glancing over instruments and the rocky ground that was rushing up at them. Duke read off fuel and altitude. Each passing second taxed their supplies. The terrain below was worse than forecast, boulder-strewn, crater-pocked, slopes with cunning shadows. Abort was a possibility. Mission Control waited anxiously for disaster for a moment. Young, however, kept his cool, pushed the thrusters, and guided Orion down onto a section of uncertain plain. "Houston, the Falcon is on the plain at Descartes," he sent back in a steady voice. They had succeeded. The terrain was unlike anything any Apollo crew had encountered. Rocky ridges rose in the gray distance. The dust moved in peculiar patterns. The highlands were not barren plains but something raw, ancient, and unnerving. When Duke stepped out, the weight of the moment hit him. "It hit me, I'm on the moon. I'm really here," he later recalled. Yet all mingled with pressure. Every action mattered. Every sample had to count. Time ticked away with each breath of oxygen. The rover stretched their capabilities. Duke had the controls, careening over the moon's surface as Young drove. They traveled to craters and ridges, gathered rocks, set down instruments, and pushed humanity's presence miles beyond where they had ever been. The thrill was tremendous, but so was the alienness of the landscape surrounding them. It was on one of those jolts that Duke had the experience he would bury for half a century. The rover had come to a halt. Dust floated aimlessly in the silence. Duke looked up, and saw it. A shadow passed along the ridge line. Not dust, not a reflection. It moved too quickly, too purposeful. A dark form, low-slung, sweeping along the horizon and gone in under a second. Training yelled at him, "Ignore it, keep your eyes on the ball, read from the checklist." Time was oxygen, oxygen was life. He didn't say anything. He bent down, picked up samples, read descriptions into the recorder. John Young never knew. Houston never heard. But within, Duke relived the incident over and over. In Orion, he questioned himself whether it was visor glare or fatigue. But the vision stuck with him. The fleeting shape branded itself in his memory, beyond rational explanation. He buried it. Decades went by, and he never said a word. Astronauts didn't talk about shadows. They talked about geology, about engineering, about hard data. But the silence did not wipe away the memory. It only made it sharper. Years afterward, Duke went back over the Apollo 16 footage. The cameras on the rover had captured just about everything. If he had noticed anything, perhaps the film had too. Frame by frame, the ancient reels flared. Dust clouds, ridges, nothing. And then, there it was. A black shape, racing across the moon's surface. It was substantial enough to throw its own shadow. Not dust. Not noise. A shape, hard and speedy, bigger than he had recalled. The rover itself was more than 10 feet in length. The glitch in the footage appeared to be similar in size, perhaps larger. Rocks don't jump across ridges. Dust doesn't travel in intentional lines. Duke halted the frame. His heart was pounding. He hadn't thought he'd seen it. Something had been present. Later, experts provided explanations: film faults, strange light glints, bouncy rocks. But none was quite right. Dust cannot make a sharp shadow. Rocks cannot streak ahead of the rover itself. The anomaly persisted, too real to ignore, too elusive to define. Why hadn't anyone else marked it? Maybe they had, discreetly, and recorded it as inconclusive. Apollo's records were enormous, and the majority of scientists were searching for rocks, not shadows. But to Duke, this was it. It was proof that his eyes had not deceived him. He kept it to himself for decades. But as the years went by and years caught up with him, the silence became too much. Duke finally ended it. "Before I take my last breath, you need to know what I saw," he confessed. He did not spin it as evidence of extraterrestrial life. He did not present it in conspiracy terms. He described what it was: a shadow, a form, an instant that plagued him. He let others interpret it. The price was real. Some wrote him off as forgetting. Others blamed him for perpetuating conspiracy theories. But Duke no longer cared. He was not the 36-year-old astronaut pursuing glory. He was a different man telling the truth that had resided in his head for 50 years. His admission did not sully Apollo's reputation, it enhanced